I buried my mother when I was 14, but no one warned me that some names refused to stay in the ground. The ballroom shimmered like something unreal, all crystal chandeliers and polished marble. The kind of place where people spoke in lowered voices and smiled like they had nothing to lose, and I stood there in a borrowed dress that didn't quite fit, pretending I belonged among them while counting the minutes until I could leave. My heels pinched, my pulse felt too loud, and every reflection I caught of myself in the mirrored walls looked like a mistake that hadn't been corrected yet. I shouldn't have been there. Not at a private charity gala where a single glass of champagne probably cost more than my weekly groceries. But my boss had insisted, said it would be good for exposure, good for connections, good for my future, as if my future had ever been something I could shape instead of something I survived. I remember reaching for a glass of water instead of champagne, my fingers brushing the cool stem, when the air shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before a storm when everything goes quiet without warning. People didn't turn their heads, not obviously, but their bodies adjusted, creating space, making room for someone important, someone powerful enough that even silence moved out of his way. I didn't look at first, because I've learned that attention can be dangerous, that sometimes the safest thing you can do is stay invisible. But then I felt it, the weight of a gaze settling on me with a precision that made my breath catch. It wasn't curiosity, and it wasn't interest. It was recognition. Slowly, against every instinct telling me not to, I looked up, and that's when I saw him. He stood across the room like he owned more than just the building, like he owned the space between every heartbeat in it. Dark suit tailored perfectly, posture effortless, eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that didn't make sense. Not for a stranger, not for someone like me. There was nothing rushed about the way he moved, nothing uncertain, just quiet control as he crossed the distance between us while conversations resumed around him like nothing unusual was happening, like the entire room hadn't just bent slightly in his direction. I told myself to look away, to break whatever invisible thread had formed, but I couldn't, because something in his expression wasn't cold the way I expected. It was focused, searching, like he was looking for something he had lost a long time ago and had just found again in the worst possible place. He stopped close enough that I could catch the faint scent of something clean and expensive, close enough that the noise of the room faded into a dull blur, and for a second neither of us spoke, just stood there suspended in a moment that didn't belong to anyone else. Then he leaned in slightly, just enough that his voice wouldn't carry beyond me, and what he said didn't feel like a question, it felt like a memory spoken out loud. Eleanor. My heart didn't just skip, it stopped entirely, like my body refused to process what I had just heard, and I pulled back, blinking, searching his face for any sign that I had misunderstood, that maybe the music had distorted the word, that maybe I was hearing something that wasn't there. But his eyes didn't waver, didn't soften, didn't change at all. I'm sorry, I managed, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. You must have me confused with someone else. But he didn't step back, didn't apologize, didn't correct himself. Instead, his gaze dropped briefly, like he was grounding himself in something, then returned to mine with a quiet certainty that made my skin prickle. Eleanor Carter, he said again, softer this time, like the name carried weight, even in a whisper. The room tilted, just slightly, enough that I had to steady myself against the edge of a nearby table, my fingers tightening around the cold glass surface as my mind scrambled to catch up. That's my mother's name, I said before I could stop myself, the words slipping out on instinct, on disbelief, on something that felt dangerously close to fear. His expression changed then, not dramatically, but enough that I saw it, the flicker of something real breaking through the control, something sharp and almost disbelieving. I corrected quickly, forcing the word out like it mattered. More than anything else, because it did, because it had to, because that was the only version of reality I knew how to hold on to. It was my mother's name. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry despite the glass in my hand, and met his gaze with as much steadiness as I could manage. She died 10 years ago. Silence followed, not the kind that felt empty, but the kind that felt full of something unspoken, something waiting just beneath the surface. And for the first time since he approached me, he seemed almost still in a different way, like the certainty he carried had just been challenged by something he couldn't immediately explain. Then, very quietly, so quietly I almost missed it, he said, "No, just that. No explanation, no hesitation, just a refusal that didn't sound like denial. It sounded like knowledge. And in that moment, standing under lights that suddenly felt too bright, surrounded by people who had no idea the ground beneath my life had just shifted, I realized something I couldn't yet understand but couldn't ignore either. This wasn't a mistake. And whatever my mother had been, whatever I thought I knew about her, wasn't the whole truth. The word lingered between us longer than it should have, stretching thin like something fragile that could snap if I moved too quickly. And for a moment I forgot where I was, forgot the music, the voices, the careful performance of belonging I had been maintaining all night, because nothing in my world had ever prepared me for someone looking at me like that and telling me something I knew was impossible. I pulled my hand away from the table, realizing my grip had tightened enough to leave faint marks on my palm, and forced myself to breathe, slow and steady, the way I used to when panic threatened to take over. Because this was not panic, this was confusion, and confusion could be controlled if I stayed grounded. "You are wrong," I said, more firmly this time, even though my voice still carried a tremor I could not fully hide, and I hated that he could probably hear it. I was there. I saw it happen. I know what I am saying. His eyes did not leave mine, not even for a second, and that was the first thing that unsettled me, because most people, when corrected, when challenged, would shift, would soften, would reconsider, but he did none of those things. Instead, he studied me like he was measuring something deeper than my words, something beneath them, something I did not even realize I was revealing. "Tell me how," he said quietly, and it was not a demand, not exactly, but it carried a weight that made it feel like one anyway. I hesitated, because that question felt too personal, too sudden, like he had stepped into a space that belonged only to me, a space I did not let strangers enter, especially not strangers who looked like they could dismantle everything I believed without raising their voice. "It is not your business," I replied, and this time I took a small step back, creating distance that felt necessary, even if it was only a few inches. For the first time, something in his expression shifted again, not anger, not frustration, but something closer to restraint, like he was choosing not to push harder even though he could. That realization did not comfort me the way it should have. If anything, it made me more aware of the imbalance between us, the quiet control he carried in every movement, every word. Around us, the room continued as if nothing had happened, laughter rising and falling, glasses clinking, a string quartet playing something soft and forgettable, and it felt surreal, like I had stepped into a different version of reality that only existed within the space between him and me. I glanced past him, half expecting someone to intervene, to interrupt, to remind me that this was just a conversation at a party and not the beginning of something I could not yet define. But no one was watching, or at least no one wanted to be seen watching, and that made the moment feel even more isolated. "You should leave," he said suddenly, and the shift caught me off guard enough that I blinked in surprise. "Excuse me." He did not repeat himself immediately, and for a second I wondered if I had imagined it, if my mind was filling in gaps with things that were not actually there. But then he spoke again, a little more clearly this time, his tone still calm but carrying an urgency that had not been there before. "This is not the place for you tonight." I let out a short breath, almost a laugh, because the absurdity of it hit me all at once. "I am aware I do not belong here," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "You do not need to remind me." "That is not what I meant," he replied, and there was something sharper beneath the words now, something that made me pause despite myself. "Then what did you mean?" For a moment, he said nothing, and I saw it again, that calculation behind his eyes, like he was weighing options, deciding what to reveal and what to keep hidden, and I realized that whatever answer he was about to give me would not be complete, would not be the whole truth, just another piece of something much larger that I was only beginning to glimpse. "There are people here who pay attention to things they should not," he said finally, "and you have already drawn enough of it." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, and I followed his gaze instinctively, scanning the crowd with a new awareness, suddenly hyper-aware of every glance, every movement, every subtle shift that I might have missed before. At first, everything looked the same, polished and composed, but then I noticed it, the way one man near the bar looked away a fraction too quickly when our eyes almost met, the way another group seemed to lower their voices as we stood there, And it was not obvious, not enough to cause alarm on its own, but combined with the intensity of the moment, it was enough to make my stomach tighten. "I think you are overestimating my importance," I said, trying to sound dismissive even though the unease was settling deeper now, threading through my thoughts in a way I could not ignore. "No," he said, and this time there was no hesitation at all. "I think you are underestimating it." Before I could respond, before I could ask another question or demand something that made sense, his attention shifted slightly, just enough that I noticed it, the subtle change in focus, the way his posture adjusted by a degree so small most people would have missed it, and then his gaze returned to me with a quiet finality that made my chest tighten. "Go home, Emily," he said, using my name like it was something he had every right to know, like it was something he had known for much longer than a few minutes in a crowded ballroom. "And do not answer any unknown numbers tonight." The words landed heavier than they should have, carrying a weight I could not explain, and before I could ask how he knew my name, before I could demand answers to any of the questions building rapidly in my mind, he stepped back, the distance between us reappearing as naturally as it had disappeared, and just like that, the moment was over, leaving me standing there with a glass of water I no longer remembered picking up, a heartbeat that refused to slow down, and a certainty I could not shake. Something had started, whether I wanted it to or not, and whatever it was not going to end with me simply walking away. I left the ballroom 5 minutes later, but it felt like I had been pushed out of something I did not understand rather than choosing to walk away, my steps uneven as I made my way through the polished lobby and out into the cool night air that should have felt grounding, but did not when my thoughts were moving too fast to settle into anything steady. The city looked the same as it always did, taxis sliding past in streaks of yellow, streetlights casting soft halos on wet pavement, people moving with purpose like their lives made sense, and for a moment I stood there on the sidewalk, clutching my coat a little tighter around me, as if that could hold everything together. "Go home," he had said, like it was simple, like I could just step back into my life and pretend none of this had happened. But nothing about that conversation felt simple, and the way he had said my name, like it belonged to him, like it had been familiar long before tonight, refused to leave my mind. I told myself not to overthink it, that rich men with too much power often knew things they should not, that it was probably just research, a quick search tied to the guest list, something logical, something explainable, but logic did not explain the way he had said my mother's name, or the certainty in his voice when he told me I was wrong. I started walking, my heels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that felt too loud in the quiet of the street, and I did not realize how fast I was moving until I reached the corner and had to stop to catch my breath, my pulse racing like I had been running instead of just trying to leave a room. That was when my phone buzzed in my hand, sharp and sudden enough to make me flinch, and I froze for half a second before looking down at the screen, already knowing what I would see and hoping I was wrong at the same time. Unknown number. The words sat there, simple and ordinary, but my chest tightened anyway, because 5 minutes ago I would have answered without thinking, would have assumed it was a telemarketer or a wrong number or something insignificant, but now it felt different, like the call itself carried intention. "Do not answer any unknown numbers tonight." His voice echoed in my head with uncomfortable clarity, and I stared at the screen as it continued to vibrate, each second stretching longer than it should have, until finally it stopped, the silence that followed somehow louder than the ringing had been. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding and slipped the phone into my bag, my fingers unsteady as I did it, telling myself that this was nothing, that coincidences happened, that I was letting one strange conversation turn into something bigger than it needed to be. But then it buzzed again. Same unknown number. This time I did not even consider answering. Not really, my hand tightening around the strap of my bag instead as I kept walking. Faster now, the unease settling deeper with each step, because ignoring it did not make it feel less real. It only made it feel like I was choosing not to see something I should be paying attention to. By the time I reached my car, parked 2 blocks away under a flickering streetlight that suddenly felt less comforting than it usually did, my heart was still racing, my thoughts still circling the same questions with no answers to anchor them. I unlocked the door quickly, sliding into the driver's seat and shutting it behind me with more force than necessary, the enclosed space offering a small sense of control that I clung to without thinking. For a moment, I just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as if the windshield could give me clarity instead of reflection, and I almost convinced myself to laugh it off, to start the car and drive home and forget the entire night. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was not a call. It was a message. Unknown number. I should not have opened it. I knew that before I even reached for the phone. Knew it in the same instinctive way I had known not to answer the call. But curiosity is a quiet kind of pressure, and mine had always been stronger than my caution when something did not make sense. I unlocked the screen and opened the message, my breath catching as the words appeared, simple and direct in a way that made my stomach drop. Stop digging into things you do not understand. I stared at the screen, my mind blanking for a second before rushing to catch up, because I had not dug into anything. Not yet, not beyond a conversation I did not ask for, and the idea that someone thought I had, that someone was watching closely enough to warn me, sent a chill through me that I could not shake. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to respond, unsure what I would even say if I did, and then another message appeared before I could decide. You should have stayed invisible. The words hit harder than they should have, not because of what they said, but because of how true they felt, how close they came to something I had spent years trying to maintain, a life where I was not noticed, not important, not worth watching. I locked the phone and dropped it onto the passenger seat like it had burned me, my hands suddenly cold despite the warmth of the car, and for the first time since I left the ballroom, I let the truth settle in without trying to soften it. This was not a coincidence. And whatever had started tonight had already reached further into my life than I could control. I did not start the car right away. I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, my reflection faint in the dark glass of the windshield. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to being watched, even though the street around me looked completely ordinary. A couple walked past on the sidewalk, laughing about something I could not hear. A taxi slowed at the corner before moving on, and the streetlight above flickered once, then steadied, casting a pale glow over the hood of my car. Nothing looked wrong, and that was what made it worse. I reached for my phone again, slower this time, like I expected it to react, like it might already know what I was thinking, and when I unlocked the screen, the messages were still there, unchanged, simple, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Stop digging into things you do not understand. You should have stayed invisible. My chest tightened as I read them again, not because I was trying to make sense of the words, but because I was trying to understand how anyone thought I had been digging into anything at all. I had not searched for answers, had not asked questions, had not done anything except exist in the wrong place at the wrong time, and somehow that had been enough to shift something I did not even know was there. I pressed my thumb against the side of the phone, hesitating for a second before opening my contacts, scrolling to the one name that had always been my default when something did not feel right. Sarah. The screen lit up with her picture, taken last summer at a beach neither of us could really afford to visit. Her smile bright and easy in a way that felt far away from this moment, and I hovered over the call button, debating whether to pull her into something I could not explain. She would answer. I knew that without question, and she would listen, try to make sense of it, tell me I was overthinking, or worse, confirm that I was not. But before I could decide, my phone buzzed again, and I froze, my thumb hovering just inches from the screen as a new notification appeared. Unknown number. Another message. My stomach dropped before I even opened it, a quiet instinct settling in that told me whatever came next would not make things clearer, only more complicated. I tapped the screen anyway, because not knowing felt worse than knowing, and the message loaded slowly, like it was taking its time on purpose. Check your glove compartment. For a second, I just stared at the words, my mind refusing to process them because they did not make sense, not in any logical way, not in any way that fit with reality as I understood it. Then I looked down, almost without meaning to, my gaze shifting to the small compartment on the passenger side of the dashboard, closed, untouched, exactly the way it had always been. My breath slowed, just slightly, like my body was bracing itself for something I could not yet see, and I shook my head once, a small, automatic denial that did nothing to ease the tension building in my chest. This was not real, I told myself. It could not be, because the only way that message made sense was if someone knew exactly where I was, exactly what I was doing, and that was not possible. It was not. I reached across the seat anyway. My hand moved before my thoughts could catch up, fingers brushing the smooth surface of the compartment handle, and for a second I hesitated, my reflection staring back at me from the side window, eyes a little too wide, expression a little too tense, like I already knew what I was about to find and did not want to confirm it. Then I pulled it open. At first, nothing looked different. Registration papers, a pair of sunglasses, a folded receipt from a gas station I had stopped at 2 days ago, all the small, ordinary things that belonged there, exactly where I had left them. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, a quiet release that almost felt like relief, like I had just proven something important, like the message had been wrong. And then I saw it, tucked neatly beneath the papers, partially hidden but impossible to miss once my eyes adjusted, was something that had not been there before. A photograph. My fingers moved slowly, carefully, like I was afraid it might disappear if I touched it too quickly, and I pulled it free, the edges smooth and cool against my skin as I brought it closer, my pulse starting to climb again for reasons I could not yet explain. It was old, not worn exactly, but not new either. The colors slightly faded in a way that suggested time rather than damage, and for a second I could not place what I was looking at, could not connect the shapes and figures into something recognizable. Then it clicked. My breath caught, sharp and sudden, as the image settled into focus in my mind. It was a picture of a woman standing in front of a building I did not recognize, her hair pulled back, her expression calm, almost distant, like she was aware of the camera but not entirely present in the moment. And I knew that face. I knew it in the same instinctive way I knew my own reflection, in the quiet, undeniable way that did not require explanation. It was my mother, Eleanor Carter. But she was not alone. Standing beside her, just slightly behind, his posture relaxed but his presence unmistakable, was a man I had only met an hour ago under chandeliers and careful smiles, a man who had said her name like it belonged to him. Adrian Romano. My hand tightened around the photograph, the edges pressing into my palm as my thoughts tried to rearrange themselves into something that made sense, but nothing fit, nothing aligned, because the version of my life I had been living did not include this, did not include him, did not include the possibility that my mother's past had been anything other than what I had been told. My phone buzzed again in my other hand, pulling my attention back with a sharp jolt, and I did not need to look at the screen to know it was the same number, the same presence that had been following me since I left the ballroom. Still, I looked anyway, because I could not stop myself, because whatever this was, it was already too far in to ignore. One new message. I opened it with shaking fingers, my eyes scanning the words as they appeared, each one settling into place with a weight that felt heavier than anything that had come before. Now you understand why you were never supposed to know. The message stayed on my screen longer than I wanted it to, the words settling into something heavier with every second I reread them, like they were not just telling me something, but reminding me of a truth I had somehow missed my entire life. Now you understand why you were never supposed to know. My fingers tightened around the phone, my other hand still gripping the photograph like it might slip away if I let go. And for a moment, everything felt too still, like the world outside my car had paused while something inside my life shifted into place without asking for permission. I forced myself to breathe, slow and steady, the way I had learned to do when things felt like they were closing in, but it did not help the way it usually did, because this was not panic built on fear alone. This was something else, something rooted in realization, in the quiet understanding that whatever I thought I knew about my mother was incomplete in a way I had never questioned before. I looked down at the photograph again, this time focusing on the details I had missed in the first rush of recognition. The way she stood slightly angled toward him, not distant, not uncomfortable, but not entirely relaxed either, like she was aware of him in a way that mattered. And him, Adrian Romano, standing beside her like he had every right to be there, like he had always been there, his expression calmer, younger, but still carrying that same controlled presence I had felt across the ballroom. This was not a coincidence. This was history, and it was a history that included me whether I understood it or not. My phone buzzed again in my hand, pulling me back into the present with a sharp jolt, and for a second I considered turning it off, throwing it into the back seat, pretending none of this was happening, but I knew that would not change anything. Whatever this was had already found me. I opened the message without hesitation this time, my movements steadier even if my thoughts were not. You need to leave that location. Now. The shift in tone was immediate, sharper, more direct, and it sent a different kind of tension through me, one that felt less like a warning and more like urgency. I glanced up instinctively, my eyes scanning the street around me again, this time slower, more deliberate, looking for something I might have missed before, some sign that this was more than just words on a screen. At first, everything looked the same quiet street, the same passing cars, the same distant hum of the city, but then I noticed it, a dark sedan parked across the street that I did not remember seeing when I first got into my car. It was nothing obvious, nothing that would stand out on its own, just another vehicle in a city full of them. But something about it felt wrong in a way I could not explain, the way it sat there without movement, without purpose, like it was waiting for something. My pulse quickened again, not sharp this time, but steady, controlled, the kind of awareness that comes when instinct takes over before logic can catch up. I looked back down at my phone, my mind moving faster now, trying to connect pieces that did not yet form a clear picture but were starting to align in ways I could not ignore. Who is this? I typed the words quickly, my fingers pressing harder against the screen than necessary. And for a second I hesitated before hitting send, knowing that asking the question meant accepting that I was already part of something I did not understand. The response came almost immediately, like they had been waiting for me to ask. Someone who is trying to keep you alive. The words settled into my chest with a weight that felt heavier than anything that had come before, not because they were dramatic, but because of how calmly they were delivered, like it was a simple fact rather than a warning meant to scare me. I swallowed, my gaze drifting back to the photograph in my hand, my mother's face frozen in a moment I had never seen before, a version of her that existed outside the life she had built with me, outside the stories I had been told. If she had known him, if she had stood beside him like that, then everything I believed about her life, about her choices, about the way she had died, was suddenly uncertain in a way I could not ignore. My phone buzzed again, breaking the spiral of my thoughts before they could settle into anything solid, and I looked down at the new message, my chest tightening as I read it. He should not have said her name to you. I stared at the words, my mind immediately jumping back to the ballroom, to the moment he had leaned in and whispered Eleanor like it belonged to him, like it meant something more than just recognition. Why? I typed back without thinking, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because at this point I was past pretending I did not need answers. This time, the response took longer, just long enough for the silence to feel intentional, like whatever they were about to say required more thought than the messages before. When it finally appeared, the words were shorter than I expected, but they carried a weight that made my grip tighten instinctively. Because now they know you are connected to him. I froze, my breath catching as the meaning settled in, slow and heavy, like something sinking beneath the surface of everything I thought I understood. Connected, not just to my mother, to him. And in that moment, sitting alone in my car with a photograph that should not exist and messages from someone I could not see, I realized something I could not unthink. This was never just about the past. It was about me now, and whatever connection I had just stepped into was already being watched. The word connected echoed in my mind like something that refused to settle, repeating in different tones, different meanings, until it no longer sounded like a coincidence, but something deliberate, something chosen, and I sat there gripping the steering wheel again without realizing I had moved, my eyes flicking back to the dark sedan across the street as if it might confirm what I was starting to understand. It had not moved, not an inch. My pulse steadied into something colder, more focused, the kind of awareness that comes when fear starts turning into clarity, and I forced myself to think instead of react, because reacting felt exactly like what someone would expect me to do. My phone was still in my hand, the last message glowing faintly against the dim light inside the car, and I stared at it for a second longer before typing again, slower this time, more careful with every word. What connection? The response did not come immediately, and the silence stretched just long enough to make me aware of every small sound around me. The distant hum of traffic, the soft ticking of my engine cooling, the faint rustle of wind moving through the trees lining the street. I swallowed, my gaze shifting once more to the sedan, trying to see something through the tinted windows, trying to determine if I was imagining the tension building in my chest, or if it had a reason to be there. Then my phone buzzed again. Your mother was not who you think she was. The message settled into me differently than the others. Not sharp, not urgent, but heavy, like something I had always known on some level, but never questioned deeply enough to understand. I looked down at the photograph again, my fingers tracing the edge without thinking, and for the first time I noticed something I had missed before, something small but impossible to ignore once I saw it. My mother was wearing a ring I did not recognize. It was simple, silver, with a dark stone set into the center, nothing flashy, nothing that stood out at first glance, but I knew every piece of jewelry she had owned, every necklace, every bracelet, every ring she had worn during the years I had known her, and this one had never been part of that life. A quiet chill moved through me, not sudden, not overwhelming, just steady, like a realization unfolding piece by piece without asking for permission. I lifted my phone again, my fingers moving faster now, driven by something I could not fully control. Tell me everything. This time, the response came faster than I expected, but not in words. Instead, a new message appeared with a single line beneath it. Incoming call. My breath caught, my gaze locking onto the screen as it began to ring, the same unknown number flashing again, but this time it felt different, heavier, like answering it would cross a line I could not uncross. I hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then I answered. Hello. My voice came out quieter than I intended, controlled but edged with something I could not hide, and for a moment there was nothing on the other end, just a faint static that made the silence feel intentional rather than empty. Then a voice spoke, low and steady, not rushed, not uncertain, just calm in a way that felt deliberate. You should not still be there. The tone was not familiar, but it was not threatening either, and that made it more unsettling than anything else. Who is this? I asked, my eyes moving instinctively back to the street, to the sedan that still had not moved, my grip tightening on the phone without realizing it. Someone who knows what happens next if you stay. There was a pause, brief, but enough to let the words settle, and I felt my chest tighten again, not from panic, but from the growing certainty that whatever this was, it was not random. You sent the messages, I said, not a question, just a statement, because at this point there was no point pretending otherwise. Yes. No hesitation. No attempt to hide it. Just confirmation. Then explain this, I said, lifting the photograph slightly even though they could not see it, my voice tightening despite my effort to keep it steady. Explain why my mother is standing next to him like she knew him. Silence again, but this time it felt different, heavier, like the person on the other end was choosing their words carefully instead of withholding them. When they spoke again, their voice had shifted slightly, still calm, but carrying something else beneath it, something closer to caution. Because she did know him. The answer landed exactly where I expected it to, and still it felt like something breaking open inside my understanding, something I could not put back together the way it had been before. How? I pressed, my voice lower now, more focused, because this was the part that mattered, the part that would either make sense of everything or confirm that none of it ever would. That is not something I can explain over the phone, they said, and there was something final in the way they said it, like the limitation was not optional. Then where? I asked immediately, because if I was already in this, I was not stepping back now, not without answers. Another pause, shorter this time, followed by a quiet exhale I could barely hear. You are going to drive home, they said, their tone shifting again, more directive now, more certain. You are going to lock your doors, stay inside, and you are not going to talk to anyone about what you found tonight. My jaw tightened slightly, frustration mixing with everything else, because this was not an answer, it was another layer of control, another attempt to manage what I did not yet understand. That is not an explanation, I said. No, they replied calmly. It is a way to keep you from making this worse. My gaze flicked back to the sedan again, my instincts sharpening as I noticed something had changed, something subtle but enough to make my breath slow. The engine had turned on. The headlights flickered briefly before settling into a steady glow, and for the first time since I noticed the car, it did not look like it was waiting anymore. It looked like it was about to move. You said people are watching, I said quietly, my eyes fixed on the car now, my grip tightening on the steering wheel again. Are they in that car? There was a brief silence on the line, just long enough to confirm what I already knew before the voice answered, calm and certain. Yes. My heart did not race this time. It slowed. Focused. Then I think it is time I leave, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, my hand already moving to start the engine as the weight of everything settled into one clear thought. This was not just about the past anymore. This was happening now, and I was already part of it. I did not waste another second. My hand turned the key. The engine came alive beneath me with a low hum that felt louder than it should have, and I shifted into drive before my thoughts had the chance to catch up, because thinking too long felt like the kind of hesitation that could cost me something I did not yet understand. The car across the street moved almost immediately, not fast, not aggressively, just a smooth pull away from the curb that told me everything I needed to know without anyone saying it out loud. They were not guessing anymore. They were following. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I eased out into the street, forcing myself to keep my movements normal, controlled, the way I had seen people do in situations they pretended were ordinary, even when they were not. Do not speed, the voice on the phone said calmly, like they could see exactly what I was doing, like they were sitting in the passenger seat instead of somewhere I could not reach. You want them to think you were just going home. I swallowed, adjusting my speed instinctively, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, where the sedan stayed 2 cars behind, consistent, patient, never closing the distance too quickly, never falling too far back. It was deliberate, and that made it worse. Where are you? I asked quietly, my voice steadier than I felt, because if they could see this, if they knew what was happening in real time, then they were closer than I had realized. There was a brief pause before they answered, not long enough to feel evasive, but long enough to remind me they were choosing what to tell me. Close enough, they said. Focus on the road. I let out a slow breath, my fingers flexing slightly against the wheel as I forced myself to stay present, to pay attention to the small details that mattered, the traffic lights, the turns, the spacing between cars, because this was not a situation I could afford to drift through on instinct alone. The city stretched out around me in familiar patterns, streets I had driven 100 times without thinking now feeling different, sharper, like every intersection carried a choice I did not fully understand. Take the next right, the voice instructed, calm and certain, and I hesitated for a fraction of a second before following it, my turn signal clicking in a steady rhythm that sounded too loud in the quiet of the car. You said I should go home, I said, my eyes catching the sedan as it mirrored my movement without hesitation, turning onto the same street, maintaining that careful distance. I did, they replied, but not directly. My jaw tightened slightly at that, frustration threading through the fear, because every answer seemed to come with another layer instead of clarity. You are asking me to trust you, I said, keeping my tone level even though the words carried more weight than I intended. You have not given me a reason to. There was a pause, longer this time, and for a second I wondered if I had pushed too far, if I had crossed into a space where they would stop answering altogether. But then they spoke again, their voice quieter, but no less certain. If I wanted you in danger, I would not be on this call. The simplicity of the statement settled into me in a way I could not immediately argue with. Not because it was reassuring, but because it was logical, and logic was something I could hold on to when everything else felt unstable. I exhaled slowly, my attention returning fully to the road as the next set of lights turned green, the glow reflecting faintly across the dashboard as I drove through the intersection. Keep going straight for 2 blocks, they continued, their tone shifting back to something more directive, more focused. Then take a left. There will be a parking structure on your right. Pull in. I glanced at the mirror again, my pulse steady but present, the sedan still there, still following, still not making any move that could be called obvious, and I nodded slightly, more to myself than to them. As I followed the instructions, each turn feeling less like a choice and more like a path I had already stepped onto. The parking structure came into view exactly where they said it would, a concrete entrance lit by fluorescent lights that flickered slightly as I approached, and I slowed just enough to turn in without drawing attention, my heart picking up again as the space around me shifted from open street to enclosed levels. Go to the 3rd level, the voice said, and I followed, my car winding upward in slow circles, the sound of the engine echoing faintly off the concrete walls as I climbed. They will not follow you in, they added, almost as an afterthought, but it did not feel like one. How do you know? I asked, my eyes scanning the mirrors again as I reached the third level, my breath catching slightly when I saw that the sedan had not turned in behind me. It had driven past. Because they are not allowed to, the voice replied simply, and something about the certainty in those words made a different kind of realization settle into place, one I had not considered until now. This was not random. There were rules, lines, boundaries I did not yet understand, but was already moving within. I parked near the far corner, the engine still running for a second longer than necessary before I finally turned it off, the sudden silence pressing in around me as I sat there, hands still on the wheel, the weight of everything catching up all at once. Now what? I asked quietly, my voice softer now, less defensive, more focused, because whatever this was, I was already in it deeper than I could step out of. There was a brief pause, and when they spoke again, their tone had shifted slightly, not urgent, not distant, but something in between, something that felt like it mattered more than the instructions that came before. Now, they said, you are going to listen very carefully, because what I tell you next is the part your mother never wanted you to hear. The silence inside the parking structure felt heavier than anything that had come before, the kind of quiet that made every small movement echo louder than it should, and I became aware of the sound of my own breathing, uneven at first, then slower as I forced it into something steady. My hands were still on the steering wheel, but I was no longer gripping it, just resting there like I needed something solid to hold on to while everything else shifted around me. What do you mean? I said quietly, my voice barely rising above the stillness, because whatever came next already felt like it was going to change something I could not take back. There was a pause on the line, not hesitant, not uncertain, just deliberate, like the person on the other end was giving me a moment I did not realize I needed before continuing. Your mother did not live the life you think she did, they said, their tone calm, but carrying a weight that made my chest tighten instinctively. I closed my eyes for a second, the words settling into something that felt familiar and foreign at the same time, because part of me had already started to understand that, even before they said it out loud. You already said that, I replied, my voice steadier now, more focused, because I needed more than fragments, more than implications that only led to more questions. Then tell me what she did. Another pause, shorter this time, followed by a quiet exhale that I could barely hear. She worked with him, they said. Closely. My eyes opened again, my gaze drifting to the empty levels of the structure around me. Concrete pillars stretching in quiet rows, shadows settling in corners that felt deeper than they should. That does not explain anything, I said, a little sharper than before, because the answer was too simple for something that had already complicated my life this much. It explains enough to understand why you are in danger, they replied, and the shift in their tone pulled my attention back immediately, grounding me in the present instead of the past. I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly against the wheel again as I leaned back in my seat, trying to piece together what little I had into something that made sense. Danger from who? I asked, my voice lower now, more controlled, because this was the part that mattered more than anything else. There was no hesitation this time. From the people who believe she betrayed them. The words settled heavily, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just factual in a way that made it harder to dismiss. Betrayed. I let out a slow breath, my mind immediately returning to the photograph, to the way she stood beside Adrian Romano, not distant, not afraid, but not entirely at ease either, like she had been balancing something I could not yet see. And him, I said quietly, my thoughts aligning into something more focused, more direct. Was he part of that? Another pause, longer this time, and I could feel the shift on the other end of the line, the careful consideration behind the silence before the answer came. He was the reason for it. The words hit differently than everything else, not louder, not sharper, but deeper, like something that connected pieces I had not realized were part of the same story. I sat there for a second without speaking, letting that settle, letting the weight of it move through my understanding in a way that felt slow and unavoidable. So she knew him, I said finally, more to myself than to them. And whatever happened between them is why people are watching me. Now, yes, they replied simply, and there was no doubt in it. No hesitation, just confirmation. I leaned my head back against the seat, staring up at the ceiling of the structure, the fluorescent lights casting a pale glow that felt too artificial for the moment I was sitting in. That still does not explain why he said her name, I said after a second, my voice quieter again, because that was the part that stayed with me the most, the part that did not fit with everything else. If she betrayed them, if she disappeared, then why would he say it like that, like he? I stopped myself before finishing the thought, because I did not have the words for it yet, not in a way that made sense. Like he never forgot her. The voice finished for me, their tone softer now, less directive, more understanding in a way that caught me off guard. I did not respond immediately, because that was exactly what it had felt like, not recognition, not curiosity, but something deeper, something personal, and that realization unsettled me more than anything else they had said. You need to understand something, they continued after a moment, their voice shifting again, more serious now, more urgent in a quiet way. What happened between them did not end the way anyone expected. I frowned slightly, my gaze lowering again as I tried to follow the thread they were laying out, each piece connecting to the next, but never quite forming a complete picture. What does that mean? I asked, my voice steady despite the tension building in my chest again. There was one more pause, brief, but enough to make the answer feel intentional when it came. It means, they said carefully, that your mother did not just leave that world behind. My breath caught slightly, my fingers tightening again without realizing it. She changed it. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication, and for the first time since this started, I felt something shift inside me that was not just fear or confusion, but something else, something closer to realization. Because if that was true, if my mother had been more than just a part of that world, if she had influenced it in a way that still mattered 10 years later, then this was not just about secrets being uncovered. It was about something unfinished, and I was already standing in the middle of it. The word unfinished did not leave me alone after that. It settled somewhere deeper than the rest, echoing quietly in a way that made everything else feel like it was just leading up to it. And I sat there in the dim light of the parking structure, trying to understand how something that ended 10 years ago could still be waiting for something to finish it. What did she change? I asked, my voice steady but lower now, because the question felt different from the others, heavier, like the answer would not just explain the past, but define what came next. There was a pause on the line, longer than before, and for a moment I wondered if I had finally reached a limit, a point where they would stop telling me anything at all, but then they spoke again, quieter this time, like the words mattered more. She changed him, they said. I froze, my grip tightening on the phone as my mind immediately went back to the ballroom, to the way Adrian Romano had looked at me, not like a stranger, not even like someone he was trying to understand, but like he had already decided something before I even spoke. That does not make sense, I said, because it did not with everything else I had been told, not with the idea of betrayal and danger and being watched. It does if you understand who he was before her. They replied, their tone calm but firm, like they were not guessing, like they knew exactly what they were saying. I leaned forward slightly, my elbows resting against the steering wheel now, the photograph still sitting in my lap, my mother's face staring up at me from a moment I had never been part of. Then explain it, I said, because I was past waiting for pieces, past trying to build something from fragments that never quite fit together. There was another pause, but this one felt different, less like hesitation and more like a decision being made. Before your mother, they said slowly. He did not hesitate. He did not question. He did not leave things unfinished. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not. And I felt something shift again, something that made the image of him in my mind change slightly, not softer, not safer, but more complicated. And after? I asked quietly, because I already knew there was an after. I could feel it in the way they were speaking, in the way every answer seemed to lead back to her. After, they repeated, and this time there was something almost careful in their tone. He did. I sat back slowly, the weight of that settling into something I could not immediately define, because it was not just about who he was, it was about what she had done to him, what she had left behind, and how that was still shaping things now. So she changed him, I said, more to myself than to them, trying to follow the line of it, to understand how that connected to me, to this moment, to the people watching from a distance. And now I am somehow part of whatever that change left behind. Yes, they said, and there was no hesitation in it, no room for doubt. I closed my eyes for a second, letting that settle, letting everything from the night replay in pieces, the whisper of her name, the way he had looked at me, the messages, the photograph, the car that followed, all of it connecting in a way that felt too deliberate to ignore. Then why did she leave? I asked, my voice softer now, because this question felt different, less about danger and more about something personal I had never questioned before. If she changed him, if she mattered that much, then why did she disappear? The silence that followed was longer than any before it, and for the first time I felt something like reluctance on the other end of the line, like the answer was not just complicated, but important in a way that carried consequences. When they finally spoke, their voice was quieter than it had been since the call began. Because staying would have changed everything else, they said. I frowned slightly, my eyes opening again as I tried to understand what that meant. But before I could ask, they continued. And because leaving was the only way to protect you. The words hit harder than anything else they had said, not because they were louder, but because they shifted the entire direction of what I thought I understood. Protect me. My chest tightened, my gaze dropping back to the photograph again, to the version of my mother I had never known, standing beside a man who was now somehow tied to everything happening around me. From what? I asked quietly, because if she had left to protect me, then whatever she left behind had not stayed in the past the way I had believed. There was a brief pause, and when they answered, their voice carried a certainty that made the air in the car feel thinner. From becoming exactly what you are becoming now. The words settled into something